I think just from a big picture standpoint, if you're looking at, you know, the parking beside this project and you're looking at the housing to the west and northwest, this is unquestionably is an infill site. It's surrounded by development or highway. The type of use here, I think, fits in that. It's a good bridge. If you look at you know, typical transitional zoning and transitional uses, I think this is something that fits that property quite well.
Anybody else on the board?
I do have one remaining comment from the fire administrator regarding stabilization to the rear of the buildings for access of fire equipment. That's a comment that the revised plan was forwarded to the fire administrator for a second review, and he restated that was important to him. So I'd ask you to respond to that comment from the fire administrator.
I think as I stated last time, we can provide stabilization to most of the buildings, to the rears. However, because of the slope conditions behind there and the fact that these buildings are very small and their ability to access them with fire apparatus from the front to the rear would not seem to be problematic. Our opinion was that you know, such stabilization wouldn't offer a heck of a lot of benefit. I mean, it would be very difficult to negotiate an apparatus behind some of those buildings that have slopes that tie back to the PennDOT right away. We could stabilize. We could do surface stabilization, or we could do subsurface stabilization. But again, it's our contention that it would offer a little benefit.
Ron, if I may, commissioners, ask a question relative to something that's not necessarily specific to land development, but more of building code and plan design. Will these units be sprinkled?
They will.
Thank you. And accordingly, whatever other code requirements are relative to fire codes and exit signs and those types of things.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me open it up to the audience. I'll make a request. Well, a couple things. First, you guys are going to have to share the microphone because that one's not working. But also, anybody who'd like to speak can have the opportunity to do so now. The request I'll make is if you discussed a particular issue last month, it's a matter of record. Please don't expand upon that at any great length. We are aware of those issues, and with that, Lee, I see you jumping up.
My question is more one of,
And just for the record,
oh yes,
I know your name.
Kenneth Lee, Post and Shell. I represent some individuals live in the development of Westover. I'm president of the Westover Civic Association. When the first meeting before the commissioners occurred, the issue as to whether or not the proposed project fits within the classification of a residential hotel came up. And at that time, I believe Keith said he does, but he was not making the official determination for starting of any clocks or time periods at that time. I assume that if approval is granted tonight, that that is going to be his official determination, and the clocks on any appeals begin at this point this evening.
I'm not going to address that particular comment, but because there is authority that indicates a oral or verbal determination, a zoning officer can be appealed. So I'm not going to give you legal advice. You don't need it. The point is, if this plan is approved, you can assume that the use is permitted in accordance with the zoning officer's previous comments. And whatever issues you have about the plan approval, you can bring forward on an appeal course.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that his initial comments were not there. So, That's all I had to say.
Anyone else?
Commissioners, forgive me, I don't know if anyone from the audience is approaching to address you, but I just want to clarify also, if the plan is conditionally approved this evening, that until such time that all outstanding conditions, including PennDOT's approval for use of Crossgate Drive, the plan would not officially be recorded. Is that the intent? Perhaps the solicitor could speak to that.
Correct, the plan cannot be recorded until all conditions of approval have been met.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My name is Mark Lindenbroker. I live at 6106 Haymarket Way, and I represent the 168 residents of Hampden Court. A couple topics that I'd like to address. Some of those the folks brought up in their discussion, their presentation earlier. The first one is I kind of agree with the idea of the marginal access comment. You know, I would like to know how many marginal access variances has the township approved? Because I know at Hampden Court, we have multiple entrances and exits out of the community. Good Hope has multiple entrances and exits. Knoll Acres has, and I'm sure there's a lot of others. So is there been a lot of variances authorized?
Before someone that knows answers your question, they're not variances, they are waivers, which is a huge difference, and I don't mean to be technical, but apparently I have to do that at times.
That's understood.
And I've been with the township for 10 years, and there's been 2 or 3 waivers that I can recall relative to the marginal access. And in each case, there was either a railroad impediment to prevent the future benefits of a cross-access easement, or some other impediment that would make the marginal access not practical. There have been probably more times where we've required an easement be identified on the plan for future construction of a marginal access. We didn't require necessarily the construction of the marginal access at the time of the land development approval, but rather that on request of the township, it be constructed within a certain period of time. When additional land developments move forward, it would make it practical for that access to be constructed.
So based on the history and your knowledge of those, does this rise to the level of approval based on prior?
For a waiver?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. The major road that it fronts is the 581 exit. There's no practical way to have access to the 581 exit from a private development, and there's no other contiguous way to access the Carlisle Pike other than Crossgate Drive. So in this particular case, staff does support the request for a waiver for marginal access.
Okay, thank you.
Real quick, Jeremy, if that waiver wasn't granted, what would occur at that point then?
If we did not grant the waiver, then I believe the board would either have to deny the plan at this point, or the developer would have to construct an alternative to provide a marginal access.
I'm sorry, keep going.
I would ask that when that waiver, I get it right, is requested, that the township deny it. The other thing I just heard him talking about was the ability, can't access the rear of the buildings because of the slope. You know, where there you're talking fire safety, life and limb. You know, if it's customary to be able to access the back of these types of buildings with fire apparatus, and you cannot do it here, I would suggest that you deny that plan. The other, you just talked about the bus stop. And based on the Cumberland Valley School District's, we're not putting a bus stop on Carlisle Pike, thank goodness. But I ask, how far is the sidewalk that they're proposing that children will have to walk through that development, out to a parking lot, across the parking lot to get a bus on Richards Road? how far are we talking about asking elementary kids to walk unsupervised?
I would estimate a few hundred yards.
If you wouldn't mind, please, just go to the mic so we can take it down for a minute. Thank you.
I would estimate that distance is a few hundred yards from the connection point in the development out to Richard, the public roadway.
So it's a few hundred yards from the connection point, but if you live in the back of the development, you know, you've added more than just a few hundred yards. And when you look at the people who are more than likely going to be living there, they're going to be young families.
Hold right there. Manager Metts, in the development behind, up on Salem Church, how far do those kids walk from the back of that development out to Salem Church?
Trendle Spring Heights.
Yeah.
It's a significant distance, or they're escorted by their parents. The reality of the situation is, while it may be a logistical issue for the developer and any prospective tenants, the school district will ultimately make the determination whether or not they agree with a proposed bus stop location. The township can suggest, and we have at times with the support of Chief Junkin, of altering locations, but by and large, the school district determines that, and unfortunately, there's nothing in our ordinance that dictates that a plan could be denied as a result of a lack of an acceptable bus stop.
Thank you.
And the last but not least, inside of Hampden Court, you know, I'm familiar to, you know, several of the board up here. We continue to have a traffic issue of, you know, people cutting through from Skyport to Lamb's Gap to get to Target and Wegmans. You know, I see this neighborhood being just another area, another source of traffic that is going to go through Knoll Acres, through Hampden Court, down the Lamb's Gap to Target and Wegmans, and increase the traffic to more than the 1 car per minute that's going through Hampden Court right now. So with that, I would ask that you deny this request. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else?
Good evening, my name is Daniel Rubin, live at 5800 Stephans Crossing. Very briefly tonight, just address a couple of things. No prepared notes on it, very informally. The first being the fire apparatus. I live conspicuously very close to some of the rear parts of the buildings that would probably be most challenged to be accessible. And given the circumstances, if this goes through and if life is at risk, I would certainly, not ideally, but certainly allow access by way of my own backyard to access those buildings. Now there's apparently going to be a 6-foot fence that divides us and some arborvitae trees or something of that nature. A lot of trees in my backyard that I would prefer not to come down and get fire trucks in, but just want to go on record and say I would be willing to comply with that. Commissioner Silcox, you mentioned the community outreach, and I know all the commissioners have expressed some interest or concerns about that each time that this has come up at a meeting. The only community outreach that I'm aware of, there's been none that I'm aware of since the last meeting. On June 13th, there was one particular meeting. I would like for the commissioners to ask who all was invited to that meeting to get some sort of evidence from the developers to find out who all was invited to that meeting. There were 2 of us that I know received direct invitation by way of phone. It was Mike Evans and myself. And one other lady who lives at an adjoining property in Knoll Acres did not find out directly from the developers, but found out indirectly from somebody, somewhat accidentally from somebody in the township, and showed up at that meeting. So there were a total of 3 of us at that meeting, where frankly we learned nothing new than what we had seen before, and that was the extent of the community outreach. It's been quiet since then. The other 2 points I want to make are just reminder points. Again, I honor your request to not elaborate, but one is the issue of parking. I've heard Manager Metts tonight, Mr. Miller, and even the developers refer to these as streets. And the zoning ordinance requires off-street parking for commercial loading and unloading zones. And we're referencing these as streets. I pointed that out before. I just want the commissioners to be reminded that should there be an incident, should there be a vehicle, as unlikely as it may be, that is in one of those zones for loading and unloading that obstructs the right of way, which it clearly will, purpose of having off-street loading, then the liability for that very well may rest here with the decision that's made to allow this for on-street loading and unloading. The final point that I would like to make, I made before, is the provision within the ordinance that states no new residential will be allowed. This is a residential hotel, and by the parking standards, as I stated last time, residential classification is what's been allocated for the parking here. So the township has called this residential, it's named a residential, and the ordinance says no new residential shall be allowed. The ordinance also says in section 104, no structure shall be erected except in conformity with all the regulations specified for the district in which such structure is located. All the specifications. Thank you.
On the question that was asked, Ron, I believe you were representing the client primarily at that point. Can you speak to the community outreach?
My name's Bob Shopper. I'm the contractor for the developer. We had met informally on several occasions with a few of the individuals, the adjoining property members. We had also, I had, through Mr. Evans, he had offered to communicate to the residents of that community opportunities in which we would be willing to meet. One occasion, I did reach out to their counselor, at which time he did say we could meet at his offices. That wasn't convenient for us. We wanted to meet where my offices are, adjacent to the site, and he had some colorful reply, so at that time we did meet with just 3 of the individuals, like this gentleman had said, and listen to what they had to say. Those comments have been incorporated into it, but fair to say they're not satisfied with the outreach that we've done, but we think we've exhausted any type of additional comments that might have been provided. Essentially, they are opposed to the development, so we really didn't have much further information to provide one another. Anything else from commissioners? Thank you.
Anyone else in the audience?
We just discussed the marginal access, again, back to the stormwater request as well. So if that was denied.
If that was denied, they would have to revise their stormwater management plan in a manner that they could achieve volume control. In a karst area, you are required, or the recommendation from BMPs, that you have a 3-to-1 ratio impervious to infiltration area, so it would significantly increase the area of their stormwater management facilities. So in this case, they would either agree to that, or you would have to deny it.
And in the initial outreach, the initial application, did it include any of the requirements on stormwater, or?
So their initial submissions included a request of a waiver for volume control, which we've approved in the past, provided that quality offsets are included in their stormwater management plan, which they have provided in this plan. Again, I do have some technical questions relative to their quality offsets and the design of their BMPs. But specifically, I don't think the comments or questions that I have technically are going to result in a significant change in the stormwater facilities if the volume control waiver is granted. The only other thing I can say is, the new township building is in a karst geology, and you can see the size of the BMPs that we are doing because we did not grant ourselves a waiver of the volume control.
Charlie, back to those 2 points here on the 2 waiver requests. If they're denied,
Well, in terms of the marginal access, I'm not sure where there would be a marginal access road to. You know, you would have a road extending along 581 to where? So I mean, I think from a marginal access road standpoint, it's not a requirement that fits this scenario unless we're gonna have a road that's gonna extend into other neighborhoods or tie into existing streets, which I don't think anybody wants. That part doesn't make any sense. So, you know, the marginal access road in this scenario is, in my mind, you know, something that is completely out of context. It's not one of those waivers that you say, well, okay, you know, is this a more of a discretionary waiver? I just don't think it fits this scenario, because every other property has access, and there's nowhere for that marginal access road to go. It would serve no purpose. On the stormwater side, you know, again, you know, it's karst, so, you know, we're not infiltrating. That was the recommendation from the geotech. We've gone all the way through the DEP, the MPDS permit process. The conservation district agreed that we're not going to be infiltrating on the site given the karst conditions and the fear of sinkholes. So that permit's been issued. Understand there's a little bit of conflict in terms of the way you know, the township's ordinances are drafted, but here we have, when you look at these types of scenarios, you've got to look at, you know, in some instances infiltration makes sense, and you do it where it makes sense. But when you have this kind of geology, and you know, in having a likelihood of sinkholes, infiltrating is a bad idea, and it's going to cause problems on the site. Conservation district would agree with that, and we've got an NPDS permit. So ultimately, we think that NPDS permit controls. But understand that the township has a waiver provision, but this is something that I think the township has granted in other instances for other projects on the same basis. You don't want to infiltrate on karst sites. And for that reason, you know, we've requested the waiver.
Is that a true representation?
That's accurate, sir.
Thank you.
question for, we gonna?
Hi, Shelley Sharoni from 201 Cherokee Drive. I don't really understand what marginal access is, but, or how it can be defined, but the one way in, one way out, is that 2 lanes or 1 lane? Or what if there's an accident that happens there that's gonna prohibit any kind of movement of any traffic inside the development? Does it make sense to widen that and have a separate one-way in and a separate one-way out? Does that comply with marginal access? Not that I'm recommending it, but because I think I speak for a lot of, people in here, that just because we're not talking doesn't mean that we like what's happening with this development. I think most of us are here because we don't like it. But would that work with marginal access to widen?
Generally, the intent of the marginal access is to provide a path for traffic to travel without re-entering the Carlisle Pike or some other major road. So you have basically a less traveled way between one property to another, maybe to get to a signalized intersection on the Carlisle Pike to make that safe. What you're proposing is, we often have required or requested an emergency access point if there's only one point of access In this particular case, the fire administrator did not make that comment. It is a 50-foot wide 50-foot wide right-of-way, and I believe a 30-foot wide cartway for what essentially is a driveway at this point. Our guidelines for streets is a 50-foot right-of-way and 30-foot cartway, so pretty much every street